Hello. I'd like to take a few moments to talk about grief. We do have the article on the course content regarding the 5 gates of grief, and I won't go over those here. I'd just like to share some other observations about grief that I think are really important. And if you haven't read Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, I heartily encourage you to read that book. One of the things that Francis talks about in the book is the very brutal, I certainly consider it brutal, proscription against grieving in this culture. We are a culture that is grief phobic. You know, if you're a working person in a professional job, you may have something called bereavement leave. If a loved one dies, you are allowed 2 or 3 days to be off work, to deal with the death, the loss, and then you're supposed to come back to work as if nothing happened. Maybe a little conversation about it, but certainly no emotion, because it's believed that, somehow we can seal off our mourning, our sorrow in those 2 or 3 days, and then go on as if nothing happened. Everything's quote unquote normal. One of the things Francis Weller talks about in his book is the fact that when we do not allow ourselves to grieve, we tend to not feel other emotions. In fact, when we suppress grief, we tend not to feel anything. And therefore, he calls us a flatline culture, like the line you see on the hospital monitor when somebody passes away. In this culture, it's acceptable to laugh and feel joy and happiness, but it's not acceptable to feel grief. It's not acceptable to feel anger. It's not even acceptable to feel very much fear. If you feel a lot of fear and it's obvious, you might be labeled paranoid or bipolar or some other silly psychological label. And so as a culture, we walk around in this kind of emotional grayness where we don't really have permission to feel much of anything. Flatline. There's a wonderful series of videos by Martine Prechtel, and the last name is Prechtel. Martine is a Guatemalan shaman, and he's made this wonderful series called Grief and Praise. And one of the things, you can watch this on YouTube, one of the things he talks about is that when we are not able to grieve, when we don't allow ourselves to grieve, we can't really feel much gratitude. We can't praise life or, abundantly praise people who express their love and compassion to us. We might mouth the words, but do we really feel it in our bones? Because grief and joy, grief and gratitude travel together. They need each other. They're 2 polar opposite sides of the same coin. And my experience has always been, when I have facilitated grief workshops, that the more people can allow themselves to descend into their grief, the more their joy, the more their gratitude, and certainly the more alive they feel. Mary Oliver says, grief and joy. What a time these two have, housed as they are in the same body. Grief and joy. What a time these two have, housed as they are in the same body. So let's just know that when we allow ourselves to grieve, it actually enlivens us. It allows us to feel our other feelings more fully. It allows us to feel more grateful. We need our grief, especially in this time of horrendous loss. We're dealing with crises right now, and I don't have to tell you, crises that we've never had to deal with as human beings, ever. Climate catastrophe, an economic collapse that is going to rival the Great Depression. Certainly, the pandemic, which may be just one of many on the way, given the relationship between climate catastrophe and pandemics. So we're dealing with so much, and we are being asked to form, as Francis Weller says, an apprenticeship with sorrow, to where we consciously sign up to be an apprentice, a student of grief. Grief is not something to get done with. Grief is something to be taught by. Grief never ends, really. And it changes and shifts and maybe takes other forms, but it never really ends. This is September 14th. And 1 month ago yesterday, my dad passed, and he died of COVID. And here on my desk, I have his ashes. And I'm just allowing myself to feel whatever comes. I remember in the last moments of his life reading him the 23rd Psalm. And I remember the tears that came within me that I felt deeply. But there has not been a flood of tears since his passing. I've done a lot of grieving about losing him over the years, even before he died. In a sense, one of those gates of grief where you grieve something you never really had. And so I feel this deep sorrow, this hole in my heart, and yet a tremendous sense of peace that my father has passed from his physical pain and passed from his emotional pain. But I don't know what form my grief is going to take. I'm now an orphan. My mother passed many years ago, and my dad just recently. How is that grief going to change me? Where is it going to take me? I have no idea. But I do know that I am its student. I am its apprentice. And what does an apprentice do? An apprentice is in an apprenticeship to deepen his or her skill. Grieving is a skill. It's a skill that this world desperately needs. And so I am open to being taught by grief and improving my grieving skills. And I hope that you as well are open to being taught by grief. And if that's a challenge, if that's difficult, feel free, please ask Terry or I for help with that. We would love to support you in one of the most important human enlivening activities that any of us can engage in. Grief and joy, grief and gratitude.